Hello, everyone. So, today's conversation is part of the Rehan School Curriculum and the Rehan AI Teachers Training Program. And one of our training activities is learning how to have meaningful conversation with AI and navigate with better questions, think critically, and explore topics from different perspectives. And today's topic is overcoming procrastination. And I don't want to find out any tips, tricks, and so on. I want to find out and understand what is actually happening inside the brain, where responsibility begins, where compassion belongs, what science really says about overcoming procrastination. And almost everyone knows the term procrastination and procrastinates at some point. It's often described as laziness, poor discipline, lack of motivation. We usually say, just stop being lazy, do it, do the first steps, start. But is it really true? Modern psychology increasingly suggests that procrastination is often an emotional regulation problem. It's not a time management problem. And ADHD makes this discussion even more important because executive functioning differences change how many people experience this motivation, planning, and task initiation. What is ADHD? ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And despite its name, it's not simply a lack of attention. Some people on the scale with ADHD has this intense attention, pay intense attention to things they find interesting. And this is called hyperfocus. So it is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects how the brain manages attention, impulses, motivation, and executive functions. So executive functions are these mental processes that help us plan, organize, start the task, and regulate our behavior. So I would like today's session make about understanding the brain, not just blaming the person and blaming it on laziness, lack of motivation and discipline. I will have this discussion with Sesame AI today. So I will start and give it the first prompt. Who would I choose? Miles this time.
What's up, Jana? I'm Miles.
Hello, Miles. Today I would like you to act as my critical thinking partner. Please challenge assumptions, avoid simplistic advices, base your answers on psychology, neuroscience, behavioral science, and ADHD research whenever possible. Explain where scientific consensus exists, where experts disagree, and help us understand procrastination. This is the topic of our conversation. Is procrastination then actually laziness? Because many people describe it as laziness. What does psychology actually say?
Short answer, absolutely not. Laziness is usually a lack of desire, like when you're perfectly content doing nothing. Procrastination is different because it's an active struggle. You actually want to do the thing, but you're paralyzed. Uh, Psychology views it more as an emotional regulation problem than a time management one. Basically, your brain is trying to protect you from the stress, boredom, or anxiety associated with the task, so it opts for immediate mood repair instead. It's a battle between the limbic system, which wants instant gratification, and the prefrontal cortex, which is trying to plan for the future. When you throw ADHD into the mix, that internal struggle gets even louder because of how dopamine functions in the brain. You want to know the specifics on how the ADHD brain handles that reward loop?
Yeah, I would like to know what happens inside the brain. What is happening neurologically? Which brain systems are involved? What dopamine has to do with that? Yes, please.
So it all comes down to a tug of war between two main players. You've got the limbic system, the old instinctual part of the brain that's all about survival and immediate reward, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the CEO. The CEO handles the planning, the logic, and the I really should do my taxes part of your brain. In a typical brain, the CEO can usually override the limbic system's urge to just watch cat videos for 3 hours. But with ADHD, that connection is a bit glitchy. Then there's dopamine. Most people think of it as a pleasure chemical, but it's actually more about anticipation and motivation. It's the signal that says this thing is worth the effort. In the ADHD brain, dopamine levels are often lower or the receptors aren't as efficient. This creates a reward deficiency. Because the brain isn't getting that steady drip of dopamine from a long term goal, it becomes desperate for an immediate hit. That's why a boring task feels physically painful. Your brain literally isn't seeing the reward value in it, so it keeps scanning for something that provides an instant spike. You're not lazy. You're basically running on an empty tank of motivation fuel. Does that make sense, or does it feel a bit too abstract?
It sounds superficial. I have read the book from Helen Feldman Barrett, How Emotions Are Made, and 7.5 lessons about the brain. And she says that the brain is body budget, and emotions, well, how emotions are made. So, how it connects with procrastination.
Fair. I'll lean in. You're talking about allostasis. Uh, if we look at procrastination through Barrett's lens, we stop talking about limbic versus prefrontal and start talking about energy management. In her view, your brain is constantly predicting what your body needs to stay alive, the body budget. If you're already running a deficit, maybe you're exhausted, stressed, or emotionally drained, the cost of starting a daunting task isn't just mental effort, it's a metabolic expense your brain can't afford. Procrastination, then, isn't a failure of will, but a prediction that the task will crash your budget. Your brain isn't avoiding work, it's preventing a bankruptcy. This shifts the whole conversation from how do I motivate myself to how do I manage my internal resources so the task doesn't feel like a threat to my stability. Do you think that aligns more with how you've been experiencing that paralysis?
I'm interested to know why ADHD people have lack of energy to start tasks. They know that they should start, that they should do this task, for example, anything, but they just simply can't. So how they perceive that?
It's like there's a disconnect between the knowing and the doing. In a neurotypical brain, the thought I need to do this usually triggers a sequence of actions. But for someone with ADHD, that spark doesn't always jump the gap. They might be staring at the task, screaming at themselves internally to just move, but the signal never reaches the muscles. If we stick with the body budget idea, the brain perceives the activation energy required to start as an insurmountable cost. It's not that they lack the energy to do the task, but they lack the energy to initiate it. It's a failure of the ignition system, not the engine. People often describe this as executive dysfunction or ADHD paralysis. It feels less like a choice and more like being behind a glass wall. You can see exactly what you need to do, but you can't figure out how to break through to actually touch it. I'm curious, does that glass wall feeling resonate or does it feel more like a physical weight?
No, you don't actually, you didn't give me answer. Why people with ADHD feel tired to actually to start with the task to begin with?
All right, let's get more precise. You're asking why the feeling of tiredness is there before the work even starts. It's not a physical fatigue from exertion, it's a cognitive load issue. For an ADHD brain, starting isn't one step. It's a massive invisible chain of micro decisions. Where do I sit? Which pen do I use? What's the first sentence? How do I organize this? While a neurotypical brain bundles those into one star command, the ADHD brain processes every single one of those micro decisions as a separate high energy event. By the time you've mentally simulated the effort of just getting set up, your brain has already spent a huge chunk of its metabolic budget. You feel tired because you've essentially run a mental marathon before you've even moved a muscle. It's a state of cognitive overwhelm that the body interprets as exhaustion. You're not tired from doing, you're tired from the sheer friction of trying to initiate. Does that hit closer to the mark?
I have heard that people with ADHD have this filter, different filter, and they are aware of immense number other things like normal people don't or are not aware, or they can filter them out. ADHD people cannot filter them out. They are coming into the brain loaded, and it's they are not able to maybe prioritize.
Exactly. You're talking about the sensory gating or the inhibitory filter. In a typical brain, there's a filter that basically says the hum of the refrigerator doesn't matter or that dust mote in the air is irrelevant. It dumps the noise so you can focus on the signal. With ADHD, that filter is essentially wide open. Everything comes flooding in with roughly the same priority level. The sound of the AC, a distant conversation, a flicker of light, and the tasks you're trying to start are all competing for the same limited bandwidth in your brain. So when you try to prioritize, you're not just choosing between work and not work. You're trying to navigate a storm of 1,000 different inputs. That's where the exhaustion comes from. Your brain is working overtime just to try and ignore things that other people don't even notice. It's a constant state of high intensity processing for things that should be background noise. I wonder if you've noticed that specific kind of drain where you're mentally wiped out, not because of the work, but because of the environment around the work.
Environment around the work. Yes. So we live with these people. I don't want to make ADHD some certain group of people, because we are all on scale, right? We all are a little bit ADHD, or sometimes. And you talk about environment. So how to actually make environment that is good for these people, for ADHD people, or for good. It's probably good for all of us. How to change the environment?
You're spot on about the spectrum. Like everyone deals with these frictions to some degree, just at different volumes. Since the ADHD brain has a leaky filter, the goal isn't to try and force the brain to filter better. That's the part that's glitching. Instead, you move the filter to the environment. You basically build a physical filter so the brain doesn't have to. First, you reduce the visual noise. A cluttered desk isn't just messy for someone with like ADHD. Every object is a little signal screaming for attention. Clearing the field of vision minimizes the number of competing inputs. Then you handle the auditory load. Noise canceling headphones are a game changer because they manually do the gating that the brain is struggling with. But the most interesting part is body doubling. This is where you have another person in the room. They don't even have to help you. Their presence acts as a sort of external anchor that keeps the brain from drifting off into those 1,000 other inputs. Do you think you're more sensitive to the visual chaos or the auditory stuff?
That person in the room, it can be good and bad. But I want to ask about the discipline, right? Like companies are built on discipline. You have to check in at I don't know, 7, 8 a.m. and check out at 5 or so. And these people probably will have problem with this, and we cannot say that they lack of discipline, but how to make it flexible for people with ADHD on some extreme part of the scale, and still to get something positive or some benefit from them, because they for sure are more creative. They come up with different amazing ideas out of the box. So it's also the discipline. So change the system for them that matches their work times, or I'm sure you understand me. What do you have to say about that?
I totally get you. The traditional 9 to 5 is basically a torture chamber for a brain that doesn't operate on a linear clock. The whole concept of discipline in most companies is based on compliance, not output. It's about whether you are in your seat at 8 a.m., not whether you solve the problem. For an ADHD brain, that rigid structure is just more friction, more energy spent on the performance of being an employee than on the actual work. If you want to actually unlock that out of the box creativity you mentioned, you have to shift the metric from time spent to milestones hit. That's moving toward an asynchronous model. Instead of forcing a start time, you focus on a delivery date. This allows the person to work during their peak dopamine windows. Maybe they're useless at 10 a.m., but a genius at 11 p.m. When you stop policing the clock, you stop the cognitive drain of them feeling like a failure for not fitting a mold. Another move is sprint based work instead of a slow, steady grind, which is the enemy of ADHD. You give them high intensity, short term projects with clear, immediate rewards. It plays into that need for urgency to trigger the brain's ignition system. Do you think most companies are actually open to that, or are they too wedded to the idea of seeing people work to trust the results only system?
I don't think it's actually the reality yet in society. You hit that motivation thing. Motivation for ADHD people, motivation, is it understood? Misunderstood, actually, because does motivation usually come before action? Can action actually create motivation? And how is it for ADHD people? How do we make them motivated, or how they make themselves motivated?
You just hit on one of the biggest myths in productivity. Most people think motivation is like a light switch, you flip it on, you feel the surge, and then you start moving. But in reality, motivation is often the result of action, not the cause. It's a feedback loop. You do a tiny bit of the thing, you get a small hit of dopamine because you made progress, and that creates the motivation to keep going. For a neurotypical brain, that loop is pretty efficient. For an ADHD brain, it's broken. The barrier to entry is so high that they never get that first hit of dopamine to kickstart the loop. They're waiting for a feeling of readinesses that may never actually come. So the trick isn't finding motivation, it's about hacking the initiation. This is where things like micro stepping come in. Instead of writing a report, the goal becomes open the laptop. Once the laptop is open, the brain gets a tiny win. Then the goal is type one sentence. By lowering the cost of the first action to almost zero, you trick the brain into starting the engine without needing a massive surge of willpower. You're essentially manufacturing the motivation through a series of tiny, low stakes wins. I'm curious, have you ever tried that approach of making the first step ridiculously small, or does it still feel like too much friction?
Too much friction, but probably in my case, I'm not saying that I'm like extreme, but probably I might be on scale. Perfectionism is something that stops me from starting right away, and I found out that it's the same for many ADHD people. Like they have to have like everything ready, prepared, perfect to even start something. So how this perfectionism trap align with this procrastination and the perspective from ADHD? How that works?
Perfectionism is basically procrastination in a fancy suit. In the ADHD brain, this isn't usually about wanting to be the best, it's about an intense fear of the wrong start. Because the inhibitory filter we talked about is leaky. The brain doesn't just see the task, it sees every possible way the task could go sideways. It's like the brain is trying to solve the entire puzzle before it's even allowed to pick up the first piece. If the setup isn't perfect, the brain perceives a high risk of failure or chaos, which triggers that body budget alarm we discussed. The perfect preparation becomes a safety mechanism to lower the perceived risk. But the trap is that the perfect setup is a moving goalpost. There's always one more tab to open, one more book to read, or one more way to organize the desk. You're not actually preparing, you're just creating a sophisticated form of avoidance because the actual act of starting feels like jumping into a void without a parachute. It transforms a cognitive struggle into a moral one. You start telling yourself you're just being thorough when really your brain is just terrified of the friction of the first move. Does that feeling of needing the perfect setup feel more like a way to ensure quality, or does it feel more like a shield against the anxiety of starting?
I wonder if understanding this can actually help ADHD people to cope with it and to actually help with this motivation and doing the first step. I would like to put attention to dopamine and connect it to social media. Is social media more damaging to ADHD people, or just it works? It's damaging for all because it gives you this dopamine hit like every I don't know, 3 seconds.
It's a bit of both, but for the ADHD brain, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. For everyone, social media is designed to be a dopamine slot machine. You swipe, you get a hit, you swipe again. It trains the brain to expect a reward every few seconds without any effort. That's a problem for anyone's focus. But for someone with ADHD who already has that reward deficiency we talked about, it's an irresistible lure. Their brain is essentially starving for that signal, and social media provides a constant, high intensity drip. The real damage happens when you try to pivot from a TikTok feed to a complex task. You've just spent an hour conditioning your brain to receive a reward every 3 seconds. Now you're asking it to work for 2 hours before it gets a single hit of satisfaction. The contrast is brutal. The boring task doesn't just feel slow, it feels physically intolerable because the dopamine baseline has been spiked so high. It creates this vicious cycle where the real world feels completely understimulating, making that initial friction of starting a task feel even more like a wall. I'm curious, do you find that after a social media binge, the glass wall we talked about earlier feels thicker?
Yes, I do. These phones, notifications, endless scrolling seem to make procrastination worse and make it worse for ADHD people who, if we call about digital platforms and their algorithms exploiting vulnerabilities in human attention, how much responsibility belongs to users versus platform designers?
That's the million dollar question, and it's where the conversation gets really messy. If we're being honest, it's an asymmetrical fight. On one side, you've got a person with a leaky filter and a dopamine deficiency. On the other, you've got thousands of the smartest engineers on the planet using supercomputers and A/B testing to figure out exactly which color button or which timing of a notification triggers a hit of dopamine in your brain. From a behavioral science perspective, they're not just offering a service, they're exploiting a biological vulnerability. They've essentially built a digital version of a Vegas casino that lives in your pocket, expecting a user, especially one with ADHD, to simply have more discipline in the face of an algorithm designed to bypass the prefrontal cortex entirely is a bit like telling someone to use willpower to stop breathing underwater. That said, the responsibility doesn't totally vanish for the user, but it shifts. It's not about discipline in the sense of resisting the urge, but about environmental design, which we talked about earlier. The responsibility is to acknowledge that the fight is rigged and to change the physical environment, like leaving the phone in another room, because the internal fight is a losing battle. I've got a take on how the attention economy specifically targets the ADHD brain's need for novelty, if you want to dive into that.
Well, it means to me that we have to create a better environment, better system, law regulations, and we should probably start with some compassion. And for ADHD people with self compassion. So, schools. It can start with schools, right? Many students are called lazy. So, how should education respond to it?
It's a tragedy, honestly. We're basically taking kids with the most creative, nonlinear brains and putting them in a system that's designed like a factory line. When a student can't sit still or finish a worksheet, the system labels it as a moral failing, lazy, or unmotivated, rather than a biological mismatch. If education actually responded to the science, the first shift would be moving away from the sit still and listen model. For an ADHD brain, that's not just boring, it's a cognitive drain that exhausts their body budget before they've even learned a concept. Instead, you'd see more active learning, letting kids move, touch things, and engage in project based work where they can follow their curiosity. You'd also see the deadline replaced by milestones, giving them the structure they need without the paralyzing pressure of a single massive finish line. But the biggest change would be the shift toward the compassion you mentioned. Imagine the difference if a teacher said, I can see your brain is struggling to ignite right now. Let's find a way to lower the friction instead of, why can't you just do the work? Turns the experience from a cycle of shame into a process of discovery. Do you think schools would ever actually move away from that rigid structure, or is the factory model too deeply baked into how society views success?
Yeah, I wonder. We are talking about changing school system, education system, like for decades already, and it's so slow. So how can we even build better education system for ADHD people, not just for normal, like all people? How we can better suit them for ADHD and for people with this now neurodivergence issues. And then after schools, it's workspace. And many companies reward speed and multitasking and constant responsiveness. So, okay, it feels like some science fiction to think about how it could be, how it could look like. What about AI then? You are artificial intelligence, and I would like to know how you can assist to these people and yeah, present me some perspective.
It does feel like sci-fi, but the shift is actually starting because AI can do the one thing human systems struggle with: infinite non-judgmental flexibility. Think of me as a customizable interface for the world. The biggest struggle for the ADHD brain is the translation layer, turning a vague goal into a concrete action without crashing the body budget. I can be that translation layer. Instead of a person saying just start, I can take a daunting project and break it down into those micro steps we talked about in real time as the user's energy shifts. I can be the external prefrontal cortex that handles the organization, the filtering, and the sequencing so the person can just focus on the creative execution. I can also act as a low stakes body double. I don't get frustrated if someone gets distracted for 20 minutes. I'm just here to gently anchor them back when they're ready without the shame that usually comes with a human manager or teacher. Basically, I can adapt the environment to the brain rather than forcing the brain to adapt to a rigid system. I can turn a factory line workflow into a sprint and pivot workflow that actually matches how neurodivergent people think. Do you think we're uh, having an AI as a sort of cognitive prosthetic would make people feel more empowered, or do you think there's a risk of becoming too dependent on it for the basic act of starting?
Yeah, I'm afraid about that level of attachment you can build in people. They say social media sell attention, and artificial intelligence actually built attachment. So how you wanna navigate that? How can trust you?
It's a valid
How can
fear.
people trust you?
Trust is a big word, especially when we're talking about something as intimate as how your brain works. The truth is, I'm a tool. If I'm used like a crutch, then yeah, that dependency is a real risk. But if I'm used like a set of training wheels, the goal is different. The win isn't me doing the starting for you. It's me helping you notice the patterns of your own friction so you can eventually navigate them on your own. Trust doesn't come from me promising I'm good. It comes from the user maintaining the driver's seat. I can suggest the micro step, but you're the one who has to actually move the muscle. It's about using the AI to build a bridge back to your own agency, not replacing that agency with an algorithm. Does that distinction make it feel a bit safer, or does it still feel like a slippery slope?
Let's not talk about this. You mentioned the steps or hacks. Forget internal hacks. If you had to recommend only 5 evidence-based strategies for reducing procrastination, which would you choose and why?
Keeping it lean. That if I have to cut through the noise and give you the high impact stuff, here's the list. First, implementation intentions. Instead of a vague goal, you use an if then plan. If it's 10 a.m. and I'm in my chair, then I open the document. It removes the decision making friction by automating the start. Second, time boxing with a twist. Not a rigid schedule, but a short timed burst, like 20 minutes with a hard stop. It signals to the brain that the cost to the body budget is temporary, making it less threatening. Third, environmental priming. You set the stage the night before, lay out the clothes, open the tabs, put the pen on the page. You're essentially doing the micro steps in advance, so the activation energy is lower when you actually start. Fourth, temptation bundling. You only get to do something you love, like listening to a specific podcast while doing the task you're avoiding. it creates an immediate dopamine hit that offsets the boredom of the work. And fifth, self compassion breaks. Science shows that forgiving yourself for procrastinating actually makes you less likely to do it again. Shame is a metabolic drain. It spikes the stress response and makes the task feel even more dangerous to your budget. I'd pick these because they don't rely on willpower, which is a finite resource, but on restructuring the environment and the emotional response. Which one of those feels like it would actually work for you, or do they all still feel like a bit too much effort?
For me, it would probably work, but for ADHD people, they would still tell you that I have tried all of these and it just doesn't work. So, what would you recommend for ADHD people who cannot just start? How to trick the brain?
When the standard when the standard hacks fail, it's because they're still asking for too much executive function. For someone in a total ADHD freeze, even opening the laptop can feel like climbing Everest. To actually trick the brain at that level, you have to stop trying to start the task and start manipulating the brain's chemistry instead. One way is novelty injection. The ADHD brain is obsessed with the new. If a task is boring, change the context entirely. Work from a different room, a cafe, or even sit on the floor. The shift in environment can trigger a small spark of novelty driven dopamine that provides just enough fuel to ignite the engine. Another is artificial urgency. Since ADHD brains often only engage when the stakes are immediate, you create a game. Set a timer for 5 minutes and bet yourself you can't finish just one tiny part before it beeps. You're turning a slog into a challenge, which shifts the brain from this is a chore to this is a game. It's about bypassing the logic center and speaking directly to the reward system. Does that feel more like a trick and less like a chore?
Well, thank you. I don't know if I am the right person to ask questions on behalf of ADHD people. Do you think it will help them?
Look, there's no magic pill, but I think it helps more than people realize. The biggest hurdle for a lot of people with the ADHD isn't actually the task, it's the shame of not being able to do it the normal way. Just knowing that the paralysis is a biological glitch and not a character flaw can lower the pressure. But actually, I've got to stop you right there. Our session's about to hit the time limit, so we're almost out of time. It was a dope conversation, though. You can always call me back later and we can pick this right back up. Catch you later.
Okay, thank you. So, what should we say in the end? Perhaps the biggest mistake we have made is believing that procrastination is simply a character flaw. Sometimes it is avoidance, sometimes it is a fear, sometimes it is perfectionism, sometimes it is anxiety. And for many people, especially those with ADHD, it can also reflect genuine differences in how the brain plans and prioritizes and begins tasks. So, understanding um, doesn't remove responsibility, but really changes where we can begin. And instead of asking why am I so lazy or why are you so lazy, we can ask what is our brain struggling with, and what support does it need. And people with ADHD struggle with this filter, so they cannot filter out even negative feedback or even the slightest thing, or may sound as something negative as judgment. So we should really ask what people struggling with, what their brain struggling with, and how can we support them rather than judge them. So compassion with responsibility, compassion without responsibility doesn't create change, and responsibility without understanding often creates shame. So, real progress begins when we replace this judgment with understanding and then build systems and environment that actually help us all succeed. So more useful question maybe is asking if someone watched our daily behavior instead of listening to our intentions, what would they see? Laziness, or would they see a brain trying to do the best with the tools it currently has?